Some mysteries burn not with flame, but with the silent promise of its light. It begins in London's winter fog, where a golden candle, left without explanation, carries with it a whisper of vengeance older than memory. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The hour is late, the case is grave. Let us follow the candle's flicker into the heart of the mystery. It was on one of those dreary evenings in midwinter, when the London fog hung thick in the streets and the lamps glowed but dimly through its yellow veil, that I found myself once more in the familiar sitting room of Baker Street. The fire burned low, though its embers cast a ruddy glow upon Holmes's long, spare figure, bent attentively over the cluttered table which bore his retorts, test tubes, and delicate balances. He was at that time engaged upon an analysis of a peculiar salt, the fumes of which lent an acrid tang to the air, and so absorbed was he in his occupation that he scarcely acknowledged my entrance. To me, after the fatigues of the day, there was something peculiarly restful in the sight of Holmes at work. His hawk-like profile silhouetted against the glow, his sharp eyes intent upon some minute change of colour, and his thin lips pressed in silent calculation. The occasional scratch of his pen, as he jotted down a result, was the only sound beside the faint crackle of the coals. It was a scene of tranquil intensity, and I confess that I was content to sit in my chair opposite, my thoughts drifting between admiration for my companion's singular gifts and a lazy gratitude for the warmth and quiet of that snug chamber. Yet, as so often in our association, such moments of repose proved but the brief calm before some strange and absorbing adventure. The stillness was broken by a sound so slight that at first I thought it merely the shifting of the coals. But presently there came again a soft, hesitant rapping at the street door below, followed by the creak of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps ascending. Holmes looked up at once, his keen ear quick to register any intrusion upon our solitude. "A visitor at this hour, Watson," said he, setting down his glass tube. "You perceive the timidity in that knock. It is not the summons of soberly dressed, with features that might once have been comely but were now sharpened by anxiety." His gloved hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat, and his glance, wandering first to me and then to Holmes, seemed to search the room for reassurance. "My name is Edmund Hale," said he at length, his voice unsteady. "I fear that I intrude upon you at an unseemly hour, but the urgency of my position affords me no rest. It was only upon the strongest recommendation that I dared present myself at your door, Mr. Holmes." Holmes inclined his head without rising. "Pray take a seat, Mr. Hale. You will find that you are not the first to disturb my leisure for reasons of necessity. State your difficulty with the brevity it admits, and we shall see if it lies within my power to advise." The man sank into the armchair beside the hearth. For an instant he pressed his hands together, as though mastering some inward agitation. His lips quivered as he began, and though the words came at last, they did so in fits and starts, as if each carried with it some burden of dread he scarcely dared release. It was evident that, beneath his formal exterior, there lurked a mind tortured by fear, and I confess that I felt a stir of sympathy for him, even before his strange tale had commenced. "I shall waste no words, Mr. Holmes," said Hale, leaning forward as though to lessen the distance between himself and my companion. "This very morning, upon returning to my lodgings in Bloomsbury, I discovered upon my table an object which has filled me with the most profound alarm. I know not by what means it came there, nor by whose hand it was placed. I can but show it to you, and beg your interpretation." With that he drew from his pocket a small parcel, carefully wrapped in paper. His fingers faltered as he unwrapped it, and at last there lay upon the table an object of singular beauty. It was a candle, no larger than the span of a man's hand, wrought entirely of gold, and fashioned with so delicate an art that the waxen folds and twisted wick were counterfeited to perfection. The metal gleamed softly in the lamplight, its surface chased with curious symbols that I could not decipher. "A golden candle," murmured Holmes, his eyes brightening with interest. "Yes, sir, and with it a note, if such it may be called." Hale produced a slip of paper and laid it beside the object. The writing was but a single line, scrawled in a bold, angular hand. "When the candle burns, the truth shall be revealed." Hale's voice sank as he added, "I am not a superstitious man, Dr. Watson, but there is that in this which chills me to the marrow. It is no mere jest. I feel it as a menace, as though some hand unseen had lit for me a funeral taper." Holmes had taken up the golden candle and now held it delicately between thumb and forefinger, turning it beneath the light with the care of a jeweler examining a rare stone. His face, usually impassive, betrayed a shadow of curiosity mingled with something graver. "It is not a toy," said he at last, laying it gently upon the table. "Nor is it the work of a common craftsman. There is in this both art and intention. The message, too, is no idle phrase. You are correct, Mr. Hale. It bears the character of a warning." Hale gave a faint exclamation, while I felt a chill pass through me at Holmes's tone, which, though quiet, had the weight of conviction. "What do you make of it?" I asked. Holmes's eyes rested upon the candle with that peculiar intensity I had come to know so well. "That, Watson," said he, "is precisely what we must discover. But mark me, it is no light matter that has brought this token to our guest's table. The flame it threatens to kindle may burn more than wax." And with that sombre pronouncement, the shadow of mystery settled over our sitting room. For some minutes our visitor sat with his hands clasped tight through the man's hands and the pallor of his lips. It was clear that he bore not merely the anxiety of the present hour, but the accumulated strain of secrets too long withheld. He paused once more, drew a deep breath, and with visible effort forced himself to continue. "My misfortune begins," said he, "with the inheritance of an estate and fortune that came to me under circumstances more vexed than joyous. The late Mr. Archer Hale, my uncle, was a man of stern disposition and few intimates. His passing, though sudden, was not without suspicion to certain tongues, though no inquiry was ever pressed. By his will I was left not only the greater portion of his wealth, but also the weight of those doubts and whispered questions which accompanied it." He paused and passed a hand across his brow. "You may judge, sir, that a man placed so has little cause for pride in his accession. My relations, such as remain, receive me with a courtesy edged by reproach. The servants speak in lowered tones, and even old acquaintances look askance, as though I bore upon my brow the shadow of some unspoken crime." Here his voice sank, and I saw how bitterly the circumstance had touched him. Holmes, however, neither stirred nor uttered comment, his gaze fixed steadily upon the man's face, as though every inflection of tone and flicker of expression conveyed more than the words themselves. "It was in this climate of distrust," Hale resumed, "that the object I have shown you this evening was delivered. I returned from my solicitors to find it upon my table, with no indication of whence it came. The landlady knew nothing of it, the servants were equally at a loss, and no stranger had been observed to enter. Yet, there it lay, a candle of gold, fashioned with such skill that it seemed at once a marvel and a menace." He shuddered slightly as his eyes fell upon the gleaming object, still resting on our table. "At first I thought it some curious token of remembrance from one who desired to test my nerves. But when I read the accompanying line, when I perceived the words, 'When the candle burns, the truth shall be revealed,' a chill struck me, such as no earthly cold had ever produced. I felt myself as one marked out, though for what judgment I knew not. Since then I have moved as under a cloud, conscious at every turn of some eye unseen. The words, spoken in halting accents, impressed me with the sincerity of his dread. Holmes alone remained unmoved, his long fingers steepled together in silent reflection. There was a pause after Hale's confession, during which the ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece sounded unnaturally loud. Holmes had not shifted his position, save that his eyes, clear and penetrating, had fastened themselves upon our visitor's face with a fixity which seemed almost to draw the truth from him unbidden. "You say," remarked Holmes at length, in his calm, level tones, "that the object was left in your room without witness, and that no explanation has been forthcoming?" "None, sir." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "And since then you have felt yourself watched?" "Yes, watched and mistrusted, even by those whom I have never wronged." The tremor in Hale's voice did not escape me, nor the effort with which he sought to master it. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin, and regarded him for some moments without speech. To me, the silence grew oppressive, yet I knew it to be the silence of calculation, not indifference. When Holmes did at last speak, it was with a quiet authority which seemed to steady rather than alarm the man before him. "You are correct that fashioned and placed it, and so rob it of its menace." He leaned forward, his eyes shining with a cold, clear light. "You ask whether I will undertake your case. I tell you that I already have. For where a symbol intrudes upon a man's life with such sinister purpose, there lies always some hidden design of greater consequence. It is that design, Mr. Hale, which I mean to uncover." I saw our visitor sink back, a gleam of relief in his haggard eyes. It was with little delay that Holmes resolved to examine the scene at first hand, and accordingly, on the following evening, we set out together with Mr. Hale for his lodgings in Bloomsbury. The fog had thickened as we drove, wrapping the city in a shroud through which the lamps gleamed like distant stars seen through smoke. The steady clop of the horses' hooves upon the wet stones sounded curiously muffled, as though the very air conspired to hush our progress. Hale sat opposite us, his face half lost in the shadow of his upturned collar. He spoke scarcely a word, and the strained silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the carriage and the rattle of the harness. Holmes reclined with closed eyes, his long fingers lightly pressed together. Yet I knew by the faint contraction of his brow that his mind was alert, piecing together such fragments as had already been furnished. To me, the ride possessed a sombre gravity. The city itself, cloaked in its winter veil, seemed an accomplice in some brooding design, while the drawn figure of our client appeared but the outward token of some deeper peril, not yet revealed. At length we drew up before a narrow house of brick, standing a little back from the street. Its aspect was respectable enough, yet there was in its stillness something of that oppressive quiet which one associates with chambers where secrets are jealously guarded. The landlady, a thin woman of middle years, received us with a fluttering courtesy. Her eyes, however, betrayed a certain apprehension, and her hands busied themselves needlessly with the folds of her apron as she led us upstairs. "It is here, gentlemen," said Hale, opening the door of his chamber. The room was furnished in plain, bachelor fashion, but it bore the neatness of habitual order. Yet, despite its commonplace appearance, I could not shake the sense that a faint shadow lingered there, as though some unseen presence had passed and left behind an echo of dread. The landlady lingered nervously at the threshold. Holmes observed her keenly for a moment, then dismissed her with a word of thanks. She withdrew with evident relief, leaving us three alone in the chamber. The golden candle, which had brought us to this place, lay upon a side table, gleaming faintly beneath the dim light of the lamp. Holmes approached the object with a precision almost reverential. He lifted the golden candle in his long fingers and held it beneath the lamplight, turning it slowly, as a jeweller might a priceless gem. "Remarkable," he murmured. "Observe, Watson, the chasing of the metal. No mere decorative fancy, but purposeful work. These symbols, though obscure, belong to no casual pattern. Each line has been chosen with intent." I leaned closer, and in truth there was in the workmanship a strange artistry that seemed to lend the lifeless metal a vitality of its own. The twisted wick, fashioned also in gold, struck me as singularly grotesque, like a parody of some holy relic. Hale, meanwhile, watched with feverish intensity. "You perceive, sir," he said hoarsely, "why I could not regard it as an idle jest. There is a malice in it, a dreadful certainty, as though the hand that wrought it desired to ensnare not only the eye, but the spirit." Holmes gave no reply, but his lips tightened slightly. To me, the candle, though beautiful, exuded a sense of menace wholly out of proportion to its size, an object less of ornament than of calculated intimidation. Holmes set the candle carefully upon the table, then produced a small magnifier from his pocket. For several minutes, he bent over the object in silence, his lens travelling from one table. "It is ever instructive," said he quietly, "to note how men choose to conceal the weightiest of messages in the humblest of recesses. Let us see, then, what revelation our golden candle conceals upon the paper." Scrawled in a bold but uneven hand were the words, "Light reveals what darkness conceals." For a long moment none of us spoke. The phrase, simple as it was, carried with it an indefinable chill, as though some hidden tribunal had uttered judgment in cryptic form. Hale broke the silence first. "Do you mark it, gentlemen? A prophecy, a threat, what else can it mean? That when this candle burns, all that has been hidden will be dragged into merciless exposure." His voice quivered, and he glanced nervously towards the shuttered window, as if expecting the night itself to press against the glass. Holmes folded the slip with care and replaced it upon the table. His countenance was composed, but his eyes gleamed with that peculiar inward fire I had come to recognize as the herald of discovery. "There is, I think, more significance here than appears at first sight," said he. "But for the present, we may be assured of this much. Mr. Hale is indeed the object of a design deliberate and sinister. The form it will take we have yet to discern, but the hand that moves behind it is already upon the stage." I confess I glanced uneasily about the chamber, seized with the uncomfortable sense that unseen eyes watched even as he spoke. The following night found us abroad once more, Holmes having expressed the opinion that Mr. Hale should not remain at his lodgings without the safeguard of watchful eyes. Accordingly, we accompanied him along the winding streets of Bloomsbury, Holmes maintaining a pace neither hurried nor slow, but measured with the caution of one who expects pursuit. The fog, ever the accomplice of London's more sinister dramas, hung close about us, dimming the lamps and deadening the sound of footfall. I had often walked those streets by day and thought little of them, but now, with Hale's haggard face glancing nervously from side to side, I felt as though each shadow harboured a menace. Holmes, though outwardly tranquil, carried himself with a certain alertness which betrayed his inward vigilance. His gaze swept the pavements with that quick yet unobtrusive movement of the eye which so often preceded his unerring deductions. For myself, I could not dispel the growing conviction that unseen eyes were fixed upon us, and that the strange warning of the golden candle was even now in process of fulfilment. It was as we passed beneath a dim lamp that Holmes's hand, light but firm, touched my sleeve. He gave no word, but his glance directed me to the opposite side of the street. There, partly veiled by the mist, yet distinct enough in outline, stood a tall man whose attitude was unmistakably that of a watcher. His shoulders were hunched within a dark cloak, and from beneath the brim of a low hat gleamed a pair of eyes so deep-set and sinister that even at a distance I felt their malice. He neither moved nor attempted concealment, but stood with a stillness almost unnatural, his gaze fixed directly upon Hale. Our client, following the line of Holmes's glance, started violently and would have cried out had not Holmes's hand restrained him. For a full half-minute the figure remained thus, motionless, his scrutiny unwavering. Then, as though satisfied or warned, he shifted slightly back into the shadow, yet without breaking that oppressive gaze. It was a moment in which menace declared itself openly, and I confess that my own nerves were touched. Holmes wasted no time in idle conjecture. "We shall require a hand from Scotland Yard," said he in a low voice. And within the hour, Inspector Lestrade had been summoned to meet us at a prearranged corner. The little inspector arrived briskly, his briskness sharpened by the chill of the fog, and a temper not improved by Holmes's peremptory message. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said he, rubbing his gloved hands together, "I am here at your bidding, though I must say you have given me little in—" No sooner had he advanced than the stranger moved with surprising swiftness into the thickening vapour. For some minutes we pursued, guided now by the faint echo of footfalls, now by the stir of the fog as if displaced by a passing form. Yet at each turning we found nothing but empty pavement and the silent glow of half-shrouded lamps. At last, even these signs were gone, and Lestrade, returning to us with visible vexation, declared that the fellow had melted into the mist as if it had swallowed him whole. Holmes made no rejoinder. His gaze lingered thoughtfully upon the direction the man had taken, his lips pressed together in that thin line which I had come to associate with a mind working upon some inward problem of peculiar gravity. When, at length, we regained our chambers, I observed Holmes more narrowly than usual. He had sunk into his chair, his long hands clasped before him, his face drawn into an expression of uncharacteristic gravity. Hale, meanwhile, paced the floor in a fever of agitation, demanding what significance the apparition might hold. Holmes answered only with a brief reassurance and a promise that steps would be taken. Yet to me, who had long read the subtler signs of his mood, the very restraint of his speech revealed more than words. There was in his silence a weight, an acknowledgement of danger such as I had seldom seen him betray. When at last Hale departed, Holmes remained motionless for some minutes, staring into the dying fire. "There are forces here, Watson," he said at length, in a tone more grave than I could recall, "which will test not only our craft, but our conscience. Keep your eyes open, for I fear the shadow that watches our client will not easily be dispelled." His words, uttered so quietly, lingered with me long after, and I felt an unease deeper than any mere physical peril could produce. The following morning found Holmes and myself seated in a dim reading room, where the air was heavy with the odour of leather and dust, and the only sound was the faint turning of pages. Holmes had procured, through certain channels, access to genealogical records relating to the Hale family, and for some hours we bent over the yellowed volumes together. The entries we discovered painted a portrait far removed from that of a staid, respectable lineage. Time and again the Hale name was linked with ventures of questionable repute, most notably in the colonies, where fortunes were amassed by means less than scrupulous. Disputes with partners, rumours of betrayal, and sudden estrangements marked the margins of more than one branch of the family. Holmes worked with characteristic concentration, his pencil moving swiftly as he made his notes. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, "how the trail of their prosperity is shadowed by quarrels over property, and by allegations of treachery. Wealth here is not inherited so much as contested, and every contest leaves its scar. As the dust of ages clung to our fingers, I felt a growing impression that the object which had so disturbed our client was no isolated token, but the latest expression of a family curse, long gestating in silence. Holmes closed the final ledger with a snap, his lean fingers tapping thoughtfully upon the cover. "There is," said he, "a continuity here, Watson, which cannot be mistaken. Each generation of the Hales exhibits the same pattern: wealth obtained, suspicion aroused, bonds of kinship broken. What begins as rivalry ends as vengeance." I recalled Mr. Hale's pale countenance and his description of cold receptions from his kin. It seemed now less the whim of estrangement than the continuation of a hereditary drama in which each actor must play his part. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "The candle, then, is not merely an emblem, it is a summons. It calls to mind ancient compacts, wherein secret societies within families preserved their own law and visited punishment upon those deemed to have transgressed. Such devices are often cloaked in symbols, and here we have one of peculiar significance." I shuddered slightly at his words. "But surely, Holmes, such practices belong to barbarous ages, or of their mistress." We were conducted into a parlour where the lady herself awaited us, a fragile figure wrapped in shawls, her face pale and her eyes bright, with that peculiar fire which sometimes attends extreme age. She greeted her nephew with a trembling courtesy, though I observed her glance flicker anxiously from him to Holmes, as if suspecting the gravity of their errand. When Holmes explained that we sought information regarding certain symbols connected with the family, I noted the sudden tightening of her lips and the way her hands clutched the arms of her chair. The air of the room grew heavier, as though some long-kept secret pressed invisibly upon its occupants. At Holmes's request, Mr. Hale produced the golden candle from its wrappings and laid it upon the table before his aunt. The effect upon the old lady was immediate and startling. She shrank back with a low cry, her frail frame trembling so violently that I feared she might swoon. "Take it away," she whispered hoarsely. "That cursed token has no place here. To see it once more is to feel the hand of the past close upon me." Holmes regarded her intently. "You recognize it, then?" Her eyes, wide with terror, fixed upon the gleaming object. "It was the emblem of the inner circle, the family's own tribunal. In my youth I heard whispers of it, how those who betrayed their blood, or seized what was not theirs, were warned first by the candle. If they heeded not the warning, then came judgment, silent, swift, inexorable." Her voice faltered, and she pressed a trembling hand to her brow. Hale sat motionless, his features blanched, as though each word were a blow upon his spirit. Holmes, however, remained still, his gaze never leaving the old woman's face. "Then, madam," said he, softly, "our task is graver than I supposed." We quitted the house as the daylight faded into dusk, leaving behind the pale figure of Miss Hale, who had sunk exhausted into her chair. The air outside seemed fresher after the oppressive atmosphere of that chamber, yet I found no relief in it, for the old lady's words had struck a chord of foreboding deep within me. Holmes walked in silence beside our client, his head inclined in thought. As for Mr. Hale, he bore the look of a man stricken, his steps heavy, and his face drawn into lines of despair. I could not but pity him, for, though the charge against him was unspoken, the shadow of ancestral vengeance had already marked him as its prey. As we drove back through the gathering fog, I found myself pondering whether we were engaged upon a matter of crime or of curse. The law might pursue a murderer, but how could it contend with traditions older than memory, or with a secret fraternity that punished not by statute, but by its own dark decrees? I glanced at Holmes, hoping for some word of reassurance, but his face, calm yet sombre, offered none, and I felt the weight of a mystery whose roots struck deeper than reason's reach. It was Holmes himself who suggested that we should test the waters of Mr. Hale's business relations, and to this end he contrived a dinner at Gray's Inn with Mr. Samuel Armitage, the late Mr. Archer Hale's partner and confidant of many years. "A social occasion, Watson," said he with a faint smile, "though it may chance to yield more profit than appears upon the bill of fare." Mr. Hale, though visibly uneasy at the proposal, acquiesced without demur, and it was arranged that we should dine together in one of the old halls where the traditions of the law lingered with an air of solemn dignity. As we drove to our appointment, I could not but reflect upon the curious composure of my companion, who seemed to treat the whole affair as a matter of trivial courtesy, while in my heart I sensed that some sterner purpose lay beneath. The gas lamps gleamed upon the venerable walls of Gray's Inn as we descended at the gate, and the sound of our footsteps echoed in the long corridor with a subdued gravity. I confess that I felt myself stepping not into a place of feasting, but into a chamber of trial. The hall into which we were ushered was weather, the recent sittings of Parliament, and some trivial scandal of the bar. But beneath the flow of words there ran a silence of another kind, broken now and again by a pause too long or a glance too sharp to be wholly accidental. Holmes, seated with languid grace at Hale's right hand, contributed little beyond an occasional inquiry, yet each of his quiet questions carried with it the weight of purpose, and I observed that Armitage's geniality grew perceptibly less assured as the meal advanced. It was when the wine had been served that the veneer of geniality began to crack. Armitage, though still smiling, spoke with a sharpness which betrayed his inward rancour. He alluded to contracts delayed, to agreements drawn in terms that favoured one side more than the other, and to assets transferred in haste from failing ventures. Holmes, with the most delicate persistence, guided the talk into channels where Armitage's resentment was more plainly revealed. "Your late partner, Mr. Archer Hale, must have trusted implicitly in his heir," said he with quiet emphasis. "Such confidence is rare, but no doubt it was justified." The flush upon Armitage's cheek deepened, and his fingers played nervously with the stem of his glass. "Confidence," said he, with a bitterness ill-concealed, "is often but another name for folly. Some inherit fortune who have done little to earn it, while others, who bore the burden of labour, are left to count themselves lucky if they receive their dues." Hale's face whitened at the words, and I saw his lips tremble. The atmosphere of the table grew tense, charged with an unspoken hostility, while Holmes, with perfect composure, regarded the speaker as though each syllable were but another tile in the mosaic of his analysis. It was then that my attention was caught by a detail so singular that it seemed almost contrived. In the centre of the table, amidst the silver and the flowers, there stood a candle, slender and white, its flame burning with steady brilliance. At another time I might have dismissed it as a mere ornament of the occasion, but now, in the context of our strange adventure, its resemblance to that ominous golden token struck me with a shudder. Holmes's eyes, I observed, had already fastened upon it. His gaze lingered upon the slender column of wax, upon the play of its flame, and then shifted slowly to the face of Mr. Hale, who sat, transfixed by the likeness. The poor fellow's hand trembled as he lifted his glass, and I could see that the symbolic echo had struck deep into his spirit. Armitage, whether by design or unconsciousness, made no reference to the candle, but I fancied that more than once his eyes flickered toward it with a peculiar expression. The simple taper, in that moment, became the unspoken centre of the company, its flame a silent commentary upon all that passed in words. At the height of this uneasy silence, Holmes stretched out his long hand, and with a sudden movement, extinguished the candle between finger and thumb. The action was performed with such quiet decision that for a moment none of us spoke. "Symbols," said he at last, his voice even and cold, "are but shadows of thought. They serve to conceal as often as to reveal. We should not permit ourselves to be governed by them." The words, though uttered in the calmest of tones, fell upon the table with the weight of a judgment. Hale gave a gasp of relief, as though some spell had been broken. Armitage, on the other hand, shifted uneasily in his chair, his face darkening with a momentary scowl before the mask of courtesy was hastily resumed. For myself, I could not but marvel at the effect of that simple gesture. The light was gone, yet the sense of menace remained, as though the shadow of the candle still hovered over us unseen. Holmes spoke little during the remainder of the meal, but his silence had in it a significance that no words could equal. Thus the dinner ended, leaving each of us with a weight of thoughts, and I perceived seemed powerless to dispel the sense of lurking menace. Hale's steps faltered now and again, and I could feel the weight of some unspoken dread upon him. Not a word passed between us, yet in the hush of that walk there was a tension sharper than any outcry. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for some blow which we could neither avert nor foresee. It came without warning. As we turned into a passage between two warehouses, a dark figure leapt suddenly from the shadow of the wall. The flash of steel caught my eye, followed instantly by the crack of a revolver. Hale gave a cry and staggered, clutching at his arm, while the report echoed strangely in the narrow alley. Holmes had sprung forward even before the shot was fired, his keen perception anticipating the danger. He thrust Hale behind the shelter of a doorway and darted towards the assailant, who, perceiving his failure, turned with astonishing agility and sped down the passage. For an instant I was paralyzed by the swiftness of the attack, but recovering myself, I saw that the sleeve of Hale's coat was torn and stained with blood. The wound was superficial, though painful, and I urged him to lean upon me while Holmes pursued the fleeing shadow. The whole incident had passed in a matter of seconds, yet it bore the weight of deliberate intention. The menace of the golden candle had become a deed. I shall never forget the figure of Holmes as he raced after the fugitive, his tall form outlined for a moment against the fog, then swallowed by it. The sound of their footsteps rang sharp upon the stones, first loud, then fainter, until only the silence of the mist remained. Hale leaned heavily upon me, his breath coming in short, broken gasps. "It was meant for me, Doctor," he muttered hoarsely. "You saw, the shot was mine." His words, though obvious, carried with them the finality of doom. Presently Holmes reappeared, moving with less haste than before. He had pursued the man through several turnings, but the fog had proved the better ally, and his quarry had melted into the night, like a shadow, returned to its source. Holmes's face, though composed, bore a look of cold determination. He said nothing until he rejoined us, then only offered Hale his arm with a quiet firmness. "The game grows perilous," was all he uttered. But the tone in which he spoke struck deeper than any flourish of alarm could have done. At the entrance to the alley, Holmes stooped suddenly and retrieved from the ground a revolver dropped in the fugitive's flight. He examined it beneath the faint glow of the nearest lamp, turning it in his fingers with the precision of a man who reads a cipher. "It is a foreign make," said he, "not common in London. Observe here, Watson, an engraving upon the butt." I bent closer and saw a curious symbol, half letter, half device, etched with evident care into the metal. Its meaning was obscure to me, but I knew from the narrowing of Holmes's eyes that it carried significance. An enemy who carries his creed upon his weapon is either bold or bound, Holmes remarked, slipping the revolver into his pocket. In either case, we have now passed from menace into open assault. Hale shivered, and I could not but feel the same chill. The weapon, cold and gleaming in Holmes's hand, was a tangible link to the hidden adversary, whose shadow had already darkened our steps. I bound Hale's arm as best I could with my handkerchief, the wound proving but a shallow graze along the flesh. Yet, as I pressed the cloth to the injury, I felt with sudden clarity that the danger we faced was not of scratches or warning shots, but of murder itself. The candle was no idle threat, I said gravely. It was the herald of this very act. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely so, Watson. The flame once imagined has now been translated into lead and steel. Our adversary has declared his hand. Hale sat lamps, and the distant rumble of a late hansom, the only sound to disturb the stillness. Our course took us southward, into quarters where the air grew dank and the houses mean, until at last Holmes paused before a deserted lane, whose entrance was half choked with refuse. "There, Watson," said he softly, indicating with a gesture the shadowed outline of a cellar grating. "Our quarry has been busy. Let us take our station." Without further word, he led me to the iron grate, behind which a faint light flickered. The street around us lay silent, yet I felt as though every shuttered window concealed a watcher. With measured care, we crouched, Holmes pressing close to the bars, his lean profile etched against the gloom. My own heart throbbed audibly in my breast, for I knew instinctively that we stood upon the brink of revelation. The chill of the stones struck through my limbs as we crouched there, yet I dared not shift, lest some sound betray our presence. Holmes remained utterly immobile, his eyes fixed upon the dim glow below. Presently there rose to our ears the murmur of voices, indistinct at first, then gathering coherence as the speakers drew nearer to the grate. One was low and guttural, the other sharper, with a note of suppressed fervour. Their tones carried the weight of secrecy, as though the very darkness were their confidant. Holmes inclined his head ever so slightly, commanding my silence. The words came broken by pauses, yet sufficient to convey their import. I strained every nerve to catch them, feeling myself less an eavesdropper than a witness to some clandestine tribunal. The atmosphere of that cellar seemed to press upon us, even through its walls, heavy with menace and the breath of hidden passions. Holmes did not stir. The faint lamplight played upon his features, and in that rigid stillness I perceived how intently his mind absorbed each syllable, fitting them into the silent mosaic of his deduction. At length the voices grew clearer, their accents charged with malice. "It must be done before the candle burns out," whispered the sharper voice. "The sign has been given. Delay dishonours the blood. And if he is guarded," growled the other, "then the more urgent. The hand that betrays must not escape. The circle waits for no man's convenience." A low murmur of assent followed, broken by a rustle as though papers were being passed between them. The words, though few, struck with the chill of doom. Hale's peril was no longer conjecture. It was decreed, formalized by a secret council that clothed its vengeance in ritual. I felt a tremor pass through me, and instinctively my eyes sought Holmes. He remained as still as carved stone, but in the glitter of his gaze I discerned the spark of comprehension. The danger we had suspected was now stripped of disguise. Our adversaries had set their hour, and the token of gold was but the herald of a blow soon to be struck. The guttural voice resumed, speaking more deliberately. "It is not for us alone. The debt is old. From the islands to the city it has passed, father to son. The wrong was never righted. The flame must be fed." A pause followed. Then the other spoke with fervid intensity. "They prospered while we were cast aside. Their wealth is built upon betrayal. This is not vengeance only. It is justice. The words, freighted with the bitterness of generations, revealed the deeper root of the enmity. It was no mere quarrel of contracts or estates, but an inheritance of grievance stretching across time and ocean, sustained by a society whose law was secrecy and whose justice was death. My blood ran cold as I grasped the import. Here was a feud that defied courts and statutes, binding its votaries with oaths older than memory. To such men, the golden candle was no trinket. Drew back. It was with a slowness that betrayed the depth of his thought. He pressed my arm lightly, and together we stole back into the deserted street. Holmes spoke not a word as we walked, but his silence was itself a pronouncement. I knew by the set of his mouth and the brooding fire in his eyes that the case had assumed a darker hue, and that the shadow of the golden candle now stretched far beyond one man's peril. The following evening, we gathered in Mr. Hale's study, the curtains drawn close against the outer world. A heavy silence hung over us, broken only by the rustle of papers as Holmes arranged his notes upon the table. He turned to Hale with a gravity that admitted of no comfort. "You must understand, sir," said he, "that what you have received is no ornament, no caprice of a malicious prankster. The golden candle is a grim device, intended as a measure of time. Its flame, when lit, marks not festivity but the approach of death. It is a countdown, a summons, and a sentence all in one." Hale covered his face with his hands. "Then I am already doomed?" "Not while the flame remains unkindled," replied Holmes, his voice as cold and precise as the instruments of his craft. "But its very existence proves that those who pursue you are methodical, patient, and inexorable. They will strike at the appointed hour, unless we forestall them." I confess the words chilled me. It was not Holmes's habit to employ metaphor when fact sufficed, and I knew that in his judgment each syllable bore the weight of truth. The candle was no longer symbol alone. It was a clock that ticked toward calamity. Holmes now began a slow and methodical inspection of the chamber. The room was panelled in dark oak, its recesses lined with books and papers, the very air of it breathing sober respectability. Yet, under Holmes's scrutiny, its dignified surfaces yielded hints of intrusion. "Observe, Watson," said he, bending low with his magnifying lens. "Here upon the skirting board, scratches faint but fresh, as though furniture had been moved with deliberate stealth. And here, upon the hinge of that cabinet, a smear of oil not yet dried." Hale, pale and silent, watched as Holmes moved from corner to corner, pressing upon the panelling, tapping with long fingers, noting with hawk-like precision each deviation from the ordinary. I, too, became aware of faint draughts where no window stood, and a subtle odour of dust displaced. "It is ever the error of the clandestine visitor," Holmes murmured, "to leave behind some print of his passage. These walls are not as solid as they appear. Somewhere here lies the means by which a man may come and go unseen, leaving terror in his wake." Hale uttered a low groan, and I felt the atmosphere of the room grow heavier with each discovery. At length, Holmes pressed firmly against a section of panelling near the hearth. With a muffled creak, it swung inward, revealing a narrow aperture that descended into blackness. The sight of it sent a chill through me, for it explained at once how unseen adversaries might have entered Hale's chamber at will. Holmes took a lamp and held it aloft, illuminating the passage. "You perceive, Watson, the worn edges of the wood. This has been used frequently. A man might stand within, unseen, and observe every movement in this room. Thus the sense of being watched was no mere fancy." Hale staggered back, his hand to his brow. "Good God! Then even here I have not been safe." "Safe," Holmes echoed quietly. "There is no safety until we unmask the hand that employs such contrivances." But mark this well. Whoever moves within these passages is bound to the ritual of the candle. That is his signal, his summons, and his constraint. I peered into the darkness, imagining unseen eyes gazing back. It required all my self-command not to shut the panel and bar it fast. Occult significance. I felt as though we had stumbled not upon an object of artifice, but upon some ritual act in progress, sinister and inexorable. Holmes bent close, his eyes narrowed. It was lit but an hour ago. At this rate its flame will reach the base before dawn. And then… He broke off, leaving the threat unspoken. I confess that in that moment I felt the oppression of a sentence already passed. The room seemed filled with an invisible tribunal, silent yet implacable, its will embodied in that single, burning taper. Holmes stood motionless before the candle, his figure rigid, his eyes fixed upon the dwindling flame. Hale, meanwhile, had sunk into a chair, his features drawn and grey, his breath coming in short, spasmodic gasps. I placed a hand upon his arm, but he shook his head with a despairing gesture. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint hiss of the wick and the occasional creak of the old house. Each second seemed to deepen the weight of impending doom. Never had I felt time press so heavily upon my spirit, nor the flame of a candle burn with such menace. At length Holmes spoke, his voice low and measured. We are in the presence of a device both symbolic and practical. It is the signal to those hidden in the passages, the warning that their hour approaches. Yet it is also their limitation, for by their own law they must wait upon its extinction. He turned suddenly to me, his eyes blazing with resolve. We have little time, Watson, but time enough if we act with precision. Thus the tension, though unbearable, drove us not to paralysis but to action, as Holmes set himself to unravel the last threads of the sinister design. The hours that followed were among the most anxious of my recollection. Holmes, with that unshakable composure which so often belied the gravity of our circumstances, passed the remainder of the night arranging his measures in Mr. Hale's study. Not a detail escaped him. The curtains were so adjusted as to conceal us from observation. The furniture moved with noiseless care, and even the angle of the lamplight was considered, lest its glow betray a human presence. Inspector Lestrade, summoned to assist, arrived with his customary briskness but little patience. "A fine time to rouse a man," he muttered, rubbing his chilled hands, "and all to watch for some phantom who may never come." Holmes smiled faintly. "Phantoms, my dear Lestrade, are often more punctual than flesh and blood. I think you will find our visitor of sterner substance." We took our stations as the night ebbed slowly into morning. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint crackle of the dying fire. Hale, pale and haggard, sat trembling in his chair, his eyes fixed upon the golden candle which stood dark and lifeless upon the mantel. All awaited the moment when the unseen menace would declare itself. It was shortly after 5 when a faint sound reached our ears, the muffled creak of a panel shifting within the wall. Holmes raised his hand in warning, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar light which always heralded decisive action. Slowly, with infinite caution, a section of the panelling opened, and through the aperture stole a shadowy figure, his face obscured beneath a hood. The intruder paused, his head turning as if to survey the room. In that instant Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm, measured, and irresistible. "You will do well to remain where you stand," said he. "The house is guarded, and resistance is folly." For a heartbeat the figure froze, one hand half raised as though to draw a weapon. Then, as if recognizing the futility of violence, he lowered it and made a motion as though to retreat. But Lestrade, with 2 constables at his back, closed in swiftly, blocking all escape. The man gave a slight shrug of resignation, as though even capture had been foreseen. The candle, still unlit upon the mantel, seemed to mock the moment, recoiled with a cry. "You!" "Then it is my own blood that hunts me." The captive made no reply, only the faintest curl of the lip betraying his contempt. His silence was more terrible than any torrent of reproach, for it spoke of a hatred too deep for words. Even when urged by Lestrade to account for himself, he held his tongue, his stare unwavering, as though defiance itself were his last weapon. It was Holmes who broke the oppressive quiet with his cool, deliberate voice. "The matter is plain enough," said Holmes, standing before the company with the golden candle in his hand. "This object is no idle trinket. It is the ancient emblem of a secret society, maintained within the Hale family. A tribunal which, under the guise of preserving honour, presumed to judge its own members and visit punishment upon those deemed to have betrayed the bloodline. The candle, once lit, served as their signal. When it guttered out, so too was the life of the marked man to end." He turned the object slowly in his fingers, his eyes upon the captive. "You, Jonathan Hale, inherited not only your grievance, but the symbols of a vengeance older than yourself. You cloaked your bitterness in the robes of tradition, and would have employed this ritual as both weapon and mask. But family honour, like justice, cannot be preserved by secret threats and midnight bullets. It perishes in the very act of such concealment." Jonathan Hale's lips pressed together in a thin line, but he spoke no word. The silence of his defiance seemed to chill the room, and I saw even Lestrade glance uneasily from the man to the candle, as though the relic itself still held some dreadful power. The prisoner was led away at last, his silence unbroken, his eyes still smouldering with that terrible mixture of hatred and resignation. Hale, half fainting, leaned heavily upon me, while Holmes stood by the window, gazing into the pallor of the dawn with a face as grave as any I had ever seen. It was no triumphal capture. The air of the room remained heavy with unspoken things, resentments too ancient for the law to unravel, griefs transmitted like heirlooms, and vengeance disguised as duty. The golden candle still lay upon the mantel, mute witness to a tradition which had sought to mask crime with ritual. I could not shake from my mind the sight of Jonathan Hale's unbroken stare. Though bound and helpless, he had contrived to seem the master of the hour, his silence an assertion that the feud was not extinguished. As we quitted the house, the first rays of daylight pierced the fog, glinting faintly upon the object Holmes carried. "The law has claimed its due," he remarked quietly. "But remember, Watson, the law cannot reach the darkness of men's hearts. That task belongs to conscience, and conscience is a sterner jailer than any jailer in London." His words lingered with me long after the dawn had fully broken. It was with a sense of profound weariness that we returned at last to Baker Street. The hour was scarcely past 7, and the pallid winter sun had begun to lift the fog into thin wreaths, casting a bleak light across the familiar sitting room. Yet what comfort I might ordinarily have found in the sight of that well-remembered haven was strangely absent. The very clarity of the morning, streaming through the uncurtained windows, struck me as harsh after the oppressive shadows in which the case had played out. Holmes threw himself into his chair without a word, his face pale but composed, while I busied myself with kindling the fire, more for the solace of its cheer than from any need of warmth. The place bore all its usual tokens: the chemical apparatus littering the side table, the violin in its accustomed corner, the armchairs drawn to the hearth. Yet these homely details seemed now invested with an unwelcome brilliance, as though the morning had turned concern I ventured to speak. "You have seen many a dark scheme unmasked, Holmes," I said quietly. "Yet I cannot recall one that has left you so grave. Will you not share with me what weighs upon your mind?" For a while he made no reply. Then, turning his eyes toward me, he said with a calmness that belied the intensity of his thought, "Watson, there are moments when the logic of crime reveals not only the actions of men, but the darkness of their souls. In such moments, words are poor instruments, and silence the only tribute to truth." Holmes rose at last and took from the mantel the golden candle, now extinguished but still gleaming faintly in the pale light. He turned it slowly in his hands, his eyes fixed upon its twisted artistry. "Light, Watson," said he, "is a symbol we are accustomed to associate with truth, with purity, with guidance. Men raise candles in temples. They kindle them at the bedside of the dying. They place them in windows to welcome the wanderer home. Yet here we see the same emblem employed as a threat, a harbinger of doom. It is the dual nature of light, that it can reveal, but it can also condemn." He set the object down with a touch of disdain. "The men who fashioned this token cloaked their malice in the semblance of illumination, as though to burn a taper were to sanctify their vengeance. But light, when employed to terrify, is a darker thing than shadow itself. For shadow only conceals. False light misleads." His words struck me with a peculiar force. I saw in that moment how even the most familiar emblems of comfort might be perverted into instruments of menace, and how slender is the line between revelation and ruin. Holmes stood before the hearth, his lean figure outlined against the glow. "It is ever the way of mankind," he continued, "to bind their actions with ritual. They imagine that in the act of repeating some ceremony, be it the drawing of a circle, the lighting of a flame, or the chanting of a phrase, they rise above their own impulses. Yet ritual is but the garment, while conscience is the man. When conscience is corrupt, the garment serves only to mask its deformity." He paced the room slowly, his hands clasped behind him. "These Hales, and others like them, have persuaded themselves that their candle was the instrument of justice. In truth, it was but the excuse for their passion, the alibi of their hate. A symbol is harmless until conscience lays hold of it. Then it becomes a weapon." I thought of Jonathan Hale's silence, his burning eyes, and the terror of his aged aunt at the sight of the candle. The family had lived so long within the shadow of their emblem that they no longer perceived where superstition ended and malice began. In their hands, conscience had become darker than any ritual, and justice a name for vengeance. Holmes seated himself once more and leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Here lies the true problem, Watson. The law of England deals with acts. It can punish theft, violence, murder. But it cannot touch those secret codes which families devise for themselves, those unwritten compacts by which honor is exalted above life itself. In such circles, a man may be condemned, not for what he has done, but for what others believe he owes." He paused, his eyes dark with reflection. "Is that justice? To them, yes. To society, no. And so the two systems collide, the law seeking order, the family seeking vengeance. Our task was not merely to capture a would-be murderer, but to break the hold of a tradition that had outlived both reason and mercy." I ventured to ask, "Do you think it is broken, Holmes?" He shook his head. "The candle is extinguished, the man is in custody. Yet the thought endures. You may silence a society, but you cannot silence an idea. It lurks, waiting for other hands, other hours. That is the tragedy of such codes. They perish only when conscience itself awakes." Holmes spoke no more, but sat in his chair, his profile etched heart when honor is twisted into vengeance. As I set down my pen, I feel again that strange oppression which clung to us when the candle burned upon Hale's mantle. The flame has died, yet its shadow remains. I can hear Holmes's words as he uttered them in that sombre dawn. "The law may bind the body, Watson, but conscience alone can bind the soul. It is in such reflections that I see most clearly the true depth of my friend, the man who, even amid triumph, feels the weight of the world's unhealed wounds. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the golden candle resting cold upon the mantel, its threat extinguished but not forgotten. "You see, Watson," he said gravely, "men cloak their hatred in the guise of ritual, believing that symbols absolve them of conscience, yet the flame that threatens another life consumes, in truth, the very soul that kindles it." I could not help but ponder his words, the silence of Jonathan Hale more haunting than any outcry. And now I turn to you. What do you think was the criminal's gravest error? His silence, his ritual, or his belief that vengeance could masquerade as justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this case intrigued you, subscribe for more Holmes mysteries, and pass the story along to those who love the art of deduction. The game, after all, is never truly ended.